Hi friends, Angelica Vanetta, co-chair of Inclusive ICR. We are a coalition of over 220 employers in Eastern Iowa, all working together to grow the diversity and inclusion of our workforce, to create a space where employees feel a sense of belonging, included, and valued. Inclusive ICR is a proud sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track of the Iowa Ideas Conference. As you participate today, be sure to connect with other Inclusive ICR champions, as we'd love to share information with you about our upcoming coalition meetings, projects, and how our work is impacting positive social change in our region. Be sure to visit our website at inclusiveiowa.org for information on upcoming events and to sign up for our e-newsletter. Thank you and have a great conference.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started as folks continue to file in from the waiting room. I'm Todd Dorman. I'm the opinion page editor and a columnist at the Gazette. And this is, in case you don't want to be in the wrong class, this is navigating Iowa's culture war, which obviously is going to deal with some of the political debates and struggles that we've had in Iowa over a lot of topics: gender identity, books in school libraries, how businesses and institutions of higher learning deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, how, what kind of curriculum teachers are allowed to teach with regard to LGBTQ, and also American history, not teaching divisive concepts that make some folks uncomfortable, particularly pertaining to race. So there's a lot of ground to cover, and we've got two panelists that are more than capable of covering that ground. I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves now and tell you a little bit about what they do. Stacy, you can go first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Stacy Kimberlin. I work for an organization called Culture All. I'm the director of DEI planning there. My pronouns are she, her. I come from a background as a classroom teacher. For the last 7 years, I've been with Culture All, working with our ambassador programs, our open book programs, which are all about relationship building, story sharing, personal narrative, emotional engagement, empathy. Our mission is to lead communities to value our diversity. And I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, Keenan.
Yeah, my name is Keenan Crow. I use they and them pronouns. I'm the director of policy and advocacy at One Iowa, which is a statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. And I think I'm best known in that capacity. If you followed the recent legislation, you probably heard something from me in the relatively recent past. The other passion that I have, though, is another community that I feel is unfairly demonized, and that is people who use drugs. So I've, in that capacity, been on the board of the Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition, sentencing structures around drug policies where my graduate research is on, and so have done various things in both of those spaces over the last decade or so.
Okay. And Keenan, I'm going to start with you. Over the last several years, we've seen a lot of bills filed at the Capitol aimed at LGBTQ Iowans, transgender Iowans in particular, restrictions on what public facilities they can use, and gender affirming care and those sorts of things. But a lot of that stuff didn't pass. It was stopped in the process. But this past legislative session, we just saw the dam break, and things actually became law. What do you think changed?
I think there's two kind of major things that I can attribute it to, maybe a few other minor things, but I'll stick to my major points. So number one is that there is a nationwide moral panic happening, particularly around transgender folks, but LGBTQ folks more broadly, right? All of the bills that passed here in Iowa were introduced and often passed in about 20 other states, as well as Iowa, right? We started off the year with, I think, 2 or 3 gender affirming care bans, and now there's 15 in the country. So this is not an Iowa specific situation. The dam has broken kind of in every red trifecta all across the country all at once, which really limits the ability for folks to push back. Because what are they going to say? Oh, you can't relocate to half the country, right? Like that's a tough pill to swallow. Number two, in Iowa specifically, I think one of the things that we can point to are the primary elections of 2022. Not even necessarily the general, but obviously giving folks more seats in the legislature doesn't bode well when those seats are filled with folks who are not interested in protecting LGBTQ rights. But I think even if that general had gone that way, if the folks who were ousted in the primary had kept their seats, the damage wouldn't have been nearly as significant, right? I'm thinking in particular, just one case study is Dustin Haidt, who was the former chair of the House Education Committee. I wouldn't say he's an LGBTQ ally in any way, shape, or form, but he was certainly more of a moderate, right? This was not his top issue to pass. And he was ousted by the governor's efforts and replaced by Helena Hayes, who runs an anti-LGBTQ hate group called Protect My Innocence. And so when you have folks who, the chairs that were previously filled with moderates and then are now filled with extremists who this is like their bread and butter issue, of course we're going to see the dam break, right? We have removed all of the barriers to those things advancing. And so those are the two big things I would say that contributed to the dam breaking this year.
And the and Haidt was beaten in a primary along with some other Republicans because they didn't support the school, private school voucher, education savings account, whatever you'd like to call it. I mean, that also has a sort of a culture war aspect to it, doesn't it? Because I mean, a lot of the schools that are private are also religious schools.
Yeah, absolutely. We found the interns and I did a big old research project, and we went through every private school handbook that we could get our hands on, and I think we got our hands on something around 95 to 98%, some really, really high number. And what we found in the ones that we went through was about 75% of those private schools either explicitly or implicitly say that LGBTQ people are not welcome. That could be anything from literally saying just LGBTQ people are not welcome to something a little bit more covert, right? Saying that you have to agree with our stance on sexual morality, and then having a separate thing about sexual morality saying that it doesn't apply to people in same-sex marriages, things like that. Or saying things like, our bullying policy applies to these classes and not those classes, or there's various ways that gets communicated, but about 75% of them, so 3/4, in some way communicated that LGBTQ people weren't welcome.
Wasn't one of the other changes that happened in the legislature that in previous years the business community, some of your large business lobbying groups, spoke out against some of the legislation aimed at transgender kids and Iowans, because they didn't want the state to appear unwelcoming, because that would be bad for business. It would be bad for bringing in conventions and events. That just sort of seemed to evaporate. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I don't think it's totally fair to say that it evaporated, right? I think what is a more accurate depiction is that there are some issues they're willing to engage in and some that they really are not willing to engage in. So, for instance, the religious exemption stuff, RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, those kinds of things, they've always been with us on those, and they were with us again this year. That was stopped largely because of business folks speaking up. And there are several others as well. If there's kind of like a one-to-one relationship with one of their employees, right? Like this law is going to impact our employee, they are typically willing to go to bat on those. If it's one step removed though, right? Like if this is going to impact my employee's kid and not directly my employee, then they typically step out of the conversation for worse, arguably. Now, what I will say is I think they will be there again for those issues that they've traditionally been there on. I don't think that they have stepped away from those issues. It's just they have kind of declined to engage in the ones that impact children. And I think that that was noticed by the legislature and identified as a whole in that coalition.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Stacy, speaking of businesses, it seemed like, after the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police and the protests that followed across the country, that a lot of businesses and institutions, stepped forward to sort of embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and social justice, and to try to sort of be on the right side of where they looked at that time that they thought history was going. But since then, it seems that there's been a backlash against it. There's been lawmakers and state officials who, warn businesses and institutions that they should not, be involved in DEI, and they should not invest, their dollars based on their concerns about, social justice, the environment, other climate change. So what do you think happened?
Yeah, there was a ton of support, this racial reckoning that we had, and people were really invested and wanted to do the right thing, and they wanted to grow, and they wanted to create a world where racism doesn't exist. A lot of them walked back, like you said, the backlash, because it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for the dominant culture to do the self-examination and do the kind of work that it takes to not only, well, before you dismantle the systems and change the structures, to do that personal development. It's not development if there aren't some growing pains. If you don't get uncomfortable, you're not learning. That's just the way humans are with difference. This thing that I don't know about, I don't know enough about, or I feel like it threatens me, or maybe I prefer it. My ability to have a complex understanding of it takes making mistakes. It takes putting myself out there and risking. It takes going beyond Io and ice and following the golden rule and treating everybody the way I want to be treated. It's a recognition of the platinum rule, which again, for those of us that are the fish in water, as I always say, that doesn't know what water is until it's pulled out, don't even understand our own cultures. And so I say that as a straight, white, heterosexual, or cis-het white woman that speaks English and is a Christian, and so on and so forth. So many dominant identities for me. I think it's the discomfort. It really is. And we are so siloed. We have these bubbles. And with social media, especially, we get into these echo chambers where, we have that like me bias and confirmation bias, and we don't have the ability to experience difference. And typically we perceive ourselves as probably more skilled than we are when it comes to interpersonal communication and developing relationships, because that's what we intend. We want to do good. We want to be good if we're equipped. And if we haven't had the opportunity to practice across difference, we tend to de-emphasize those differences because it feels better. It's easier. And I think that's a large part of what's gone on.
Yeah, well, and in your work, you have programs and efforts that try to break down those silos and those barriers and bring people, diverse groups of people together to have, to have personal relationships, which is, seems like that's how you break through this, is people don't fear, what they know and people they know. And so that's what, that seems to be sort of the grassroots solution. So why don't you tell us about what some of the work that you've done?
Sure. With Cultural, we use a proprietary tool called the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory. And that is a measurement of a person's or an organization's capacity to accept and adapt to difference. And it really is a function of your experience. Proximity doesn't make us more culturally agile across difference, because again, we can focus on our commonality and not go there with the difference, because not that we don't see it, but we don't think it's as important as getting along and maintaining everybody's comfort. So that's a tool that we use, but we definitely recommend being able to experience differences in a way that is formative and relationship building, thereby building community by deepening your understanding, starting with, if I want to influence somebody, that's not going to be by my talking. It's going to be listening to them. It's going to be listening to them, validating their lived experience. If my lived experience is that I've had marginalization for being a woman or for being fat or for being older, that is my lived experience. Someone else who's not experienced depression has a valid lived experience. Being able to recognize that and acknowledge that and help somebody maintain dignity will allow me to sometime, hopefully, have an influence that they'll reciprocate and do the same for me. And if there are folks that are racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, whatever, they're going to maintain that and not do any personal growth if I walk away from them, if I abandon them, if I don't want to be in a relationship. And there, it's not for everybody, but if I have the stamina to maintain relationship. So I think of it as goal-directed behavior, right? What's my goal? What's my role? And what can I do without losing my soul? But if I really want to have some influence, it is important for me to understand where that other person is coming from. And I've been fortunate to all of my life be surrounded by people who have different political ideologies than I do in my family and in my friendships. And it really is about understanding that, like I said before, I think I said before, people want to do good and want to be good when they're equipped. So if somebody has a different opinion than me, it doesn't mean they're evil or they want to hurt other people. They just have a different understanding than I do. So it really is about those opportunities for building relationship. And that's what we do in our work.
I always think back to 2009, to the Supreme Court ruling where marriage equality was made legal in Iowa. And, at first the polling was negative, but once people it was an emboldening moment for the LGBTQ community. They, and then people recognize, hey, this is my neighbor. This is a person I work with. These people are I'm getting invited to a wedding. I mean, things like that. Keenan, is that day going to come for transgender Iowans, or is that, we're so red now that we're not capable of accepting that?
There is a big partisan lens to it, but there was just polling that came out literally yesterday from Data for Progress, and what it showed was that, kind of regardless of party affiliation, that knowing a transgender person is a 30-point increase in their likelihood to support transgender rights, right? So it's obvious that if you have a new piece of information and you have and it's about a group and you have a member of that group to cross-check that information against, that you're immediately going to know whether that's accurate or not. But if you don't have that person to cross-check that against, then anything kind of seems plausible at some point. The other piece of data in that is kind of explains a little bit more of the moral panic is that only about 30% of likely voters know a transgender person. And so that's kind of why we're in the hole that we are right now, whereas I believe it was something like 75% of likely voters knew a gay person. So that's why we are is simply more people know a gay person. And so that misinformation doesn't fly as easily for that particular group. So the confounding factor, of course, is that gay and lesbian and bisexual people are anywhere from 7 to 10% of the population, depending on how you count it. But transgender people are about 0.5 to 1% of the population, depending on how you count it. So there's just far less of them to know, far less of them to encounter, which makes it hard. Now, I guess what I will say is that regardless of this, that fear and disinformation in this kind of playbook that we've seen ultimately does have a limited shelf life. Like, ultimately, people are going to become more familiar with transgender folks. They're going to have them in their lives. And as more transgender people come out and into the open, that is not going to work as well, which is exactly why they're trying to discourage people from coming out by, reviving the groomer slur and connecting anybody who speaks out to it to butchery and pedophilia and all this other horrible stuff. That whole effort is just to combat the thing that they know is coming, which is that there is an expiration date to this tactic.
Well, and it's interesting
Agree.
that, some of the same people that were just, making all sorts of dire warnings of the end of Western civilization after the Supreme Court ruled on marriage are the same people that are out here now, making those same arguments about transgender kids in schools. It
Right.
just, the shelf life it's I'm glad that you say the shelf life is short, because that product keeps being sold to us, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the same people that said all the gates of hell were going to open if we allowed marriage equality to to be the law of the land are now very quiet about marriage equality, right? Because they know that their prediction wasn't accurate. And it's kind of bizarre to me to see predictions where the evidence is actually in the opposite direction, right? We heard all of these scare stories when the bathroom bill was being debated about how there's going to be assaults in our bathrooms and all this. Trans kids have been able to use the bathroom to match their gender identity since 2007. And like in that 16-year period, there wasn't a single incident that I'm aware of a trans kid assaulting a cis kid in a bathroom. And so you've got 16 years of evidence to the contrary, and yet that's still the talking point that they go with. Again, that might work in the short term for them, but eventually it's going to look very silly.
Yeah.
Can I add, Todd?
Oh, go ahead. Yes, please.
Yeah. And I want to speak to that too, Keenan, just to add to what you said. We have seen, or I have seen in my lifetime, people that were afraid to come out of the closet for fear of being abused, right? For fear of violence, to, for most of the country, a complete normalization. Everybody knows somebody gay. In our media and everything, it's normalized, right? It's just a part of how someone is. And for millennia, we've had non-binary people and trans people. And when my child, I have a transgender daughter, was a young person, we really didn't have the language to talk about it. We didn't have the experience. There weren't visible out people as there are becoming more and more of today. So it is just a process of, oh yeah, this is just another facet of somebody's identity. And we won't have the kind of, visceral reactions that people have when they see something novel. Oh, I've never seen somebody that is masculine presenting, but is expressing feminine, right? And so it's just a kind of a new thing that we just have to get used to. And as we spend more time and have more community and know more people that are many different ways and cultures and identities and all of that, it will normalize. So I absolutely agree with Keenan that there's a short shelf life, especially when we look at Generation Z and their ideas and opinions. And we can all probably recognize that it's a political strategy, right? There has to be a wedge issue. Your folks, your base. And unfortunately for our LGBTQI plus folks, this is it, especially our trans folks. So it's gamesmanship, political gamesmanship.
Yeah,
and
I was going
fear
back.
comes with it.
Yeah, I recently went back and watched the Ballot Measure 9 documentary, which was made in 1995 around the Oregon Ballot Measure 9 back in 1992. And my mentor, Donna Red Wing, was a big part of the fight against that. And I mean, when you listen to the opposition, the claims they are making are just so outrageous and detached from reality. And anybody listening to that today can see that, right? Even on the conservative side, they know that is complete nonsense. And that's how it seems to be right now that we are about transgender people. Mm-hmm. It's just not everybody sees it as ridiculous yet, because again, not everybody knows a trans person, but those arguments are going to appear just as ridiculous in the next decade.
Yeah. And that reframing happens, right? So we went from with marriage equality, what people are doing in the bedroom that people were worried about, to families, right? And love, and being able to love who you love, and to raise children, and all of that. And it was a much more wholesome, I guess, for lack of a better word, and more palatable to a lot of folks that might have been opposed in the past. So that reframing again is important. And I think talking about the construct of gender and how we got to what, a lot of people have an opinion about God made a man and a woman, and that's all there is. There's so much more science and just evidence that we can draw on.
Well, and that seems like, that sort of battle of ideas. They're trying to wage this effort in schools, in younger grades. There's a law now that you can't talk about LGBTQ concepts, the fact that these families exist and that people live in your community, and that you can't do that in K through 6th grade, which a lot of school districts have 6th, 7th, and 8th grade in one building. So that spills over into junior high. It's just, it seems like they're trying to sort of, erase that from the education being administered to kids. And I guess I just wondered what either of you thinks the impact of that is going to be going forward, as to how people sort of, deal with the change, social change.
I guess what I would say is there's two things here. Number one, is it going to be harmful to LGBTQ kids? Yes, it sends a message to them that like their existence is not welcome, or that talking about them is somehow controversial or makes them unworthy, etc. But number two, I would say, in terms of the information, that's very much a toothpaste back in the tube situation, right? Like, that's not happening. It's just not gonna. The internet exists, right? And trans people are occupying now major positions in popular culture, and so it's not realistic to think that just prohibiting teachers from talking about it means that is somehow going away, or that's changing somebody's mind about it. Do I think that it's ultimately going to harm youth and their families? Absolutely it will. But do I think that this changes like the cultural landscape around LGBTQ people, or in any way changes public opinion in a negative way? I don't think so. My money is that it doesn't do that at all.
And with regard to the restriction on books, the supporters of that emphasize that they don't want kids to access depictions of sex. But then you look at the lists of authors that are, and you see, authors of color, you see LGBTQ authors, and then you start wondering whether it's really about depictions of sex, or it's more about, people learning new ideas from people who have lived lives that are far different than their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Des Moines Register did a study on all the challenges, right? And like 90% of them were people with marginalized identities were the authors. And so it gets to be a little bit transparent when you actually dig into the data. Yes, they have a kind of a non-biased rationale for it, but the actual implementation tells a very, very different story. It's also very instructive when you point out a book that they like that has a sex act in it, and all of a sudden it's, oh, well, that's not graphic, that's not really a depiction. Yeah, it is. It's just you don't like the implication that your book is now going to come off the shelf because it fits the criteria, right? I think my go-to example has been 1984. There is a sex act in that book. There is a description of a sex act in the book. It's not particularly graphic, but the law doesn't say graphic depiction. It says depiction, right? And so Urbandale pulled it off the shelves and everybody cried foul and said, that's not what we meant, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's the law you wrote. Now, whether or not you put in additional guidance to say not this book is a different matter, and whether or not that's not what you meant is a different matter, but that's what you wrote, and that's going to have the force of pulling books off the shelf. So would I rather that people adopt a very narrow thing and take as few books off the shelf as possible? Yes. But does that mean that that's not what you wrote? No, that's an absurd characterization.
Stacy, did you have anything to add to the, the education aspect of this?
Yeah, I apologize. I lost my internet for a moment. As a former classroom teacher, I certainly have a lot of opinions and could get on a soapbox. I think that, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I just recovered from COVID.
Oh,
Yeah.
The brain fog is real.
It is.
yeah,
It is
right.
real. Yeah. Yeah. Forgive me. Forgive me. And so I don't know all of what Keenan responded with, but I know that the unintentional consequences of, oh, we don't want to sexualize children. Well, then you can't show heterosexual couples either. And you, again, what are you really intending here, and what's going to be the impact? And, I'm opposed to censorship in any form, but and I'm also about protecting children, but also empowering them to face what they're going to face in the real world. I've worked with a school district, and, they were trying to work on racism, right? And they had all these students come back from college their first year to say, we had no idea. We were not prepared. We didn't talk about this in a real way, in a meaningful way. So if we want to prepare students with for a global multicultural world with 21st century skills, then we need to prepare them for what they're going to encounter. And that means all kinds of ideas. So yeah, that's all to say about that.
Yeah, that's
the other kind of interesting development that I've seen that is kind of bizarre to me is there's kind of two trigger words that people really gravitate toward. And I've seen criticism in particular of graphic novels simply because they have the word graphic in them. And so people assume that there's going to be a graphic depiction. And then the second one is anything involving sexual orientation, which is, about who people have a relationship with and how they're oriented. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with like sex acts, but because the word sexual is in it, and it's like kind of automatically associated with sex, which I think is a huge mistake, and it's been a barrier to a lot of like sincere conversations that I've had with folks.
We've got some questions from the folks out there watching. Here's one. It says, equity and inclusion are core values of many nonprofits doing work in Iowa, but speaking out feels dangerous when we receive state funding. What is your advice for agencies walking this line? Either of you are welcome to take that.
It is about relationship building. So talk about reframing. It's about getting to know each other. If we're going to love each other as humans, we have to follow that platinum rule, right? Instead of I don't know if I already said this, the golden rule following Iowa nice, everybody gets along. But if we really want to, and I'm a Christian, so I'm going to go there. My greatest charge is to love my neighbor. And so it's my responsibility to learn how to love my neighbor, and their responsibility to teach me how to love them. It's our responsibility together to build that relationship and build a community that we want to see, co-create the community that we want to see. And, that's what peace is. Peace is building. War is destruction. And again, it's my universal belief about people that they want to be able to be welcoming. We agree everybody deserves to be welcome. Everybody deserves to have the skills to be able to be welcoming, and framing it as it's belonging. It's honoring people, and it is leveraging our differences to make a greater outcome, whether that's our product or our service or whatever the community looks like.
Well, and Keenan, it seems like, this is just another example of a chilling effect.
Exactly,
and we've seen that spawned by so many aspects of this. Teachers are afraid to teach certain books. They're not, and concepts, and universities are now afraid of, what they can do for DEI. And the list goes on and on. That's sort of the power behind the letter of the law in these cases, isn't it?
Yeah. I've spent way more of my last year or so talking to organizations, companies, etc., about something that I never thought I would really have to talk to them about. And it's kind of two concepts generally lumped into one category. And the two concepts are how to respond to terrorist threats and how to respond to authoritarian regimes, both of which a lot of folks have had to deal with lately. And one thing that we see over and over and over again with these kind of authoritarian models is that they recruit people to do their work for them, and they recruit people to cover for them, right? And one of the ways they do that is by withholding resources and saying, if you don't cover for us, if you don't shut up, then we will bleed you of your funding, or we will do that, we'll take away your teaching license, or we will do X, Y, or Z. And my biggest message to those folks has always been, don't help them. Like, if they're going to do something bad to you, let them do it, right? They're planning on doing it anyway. And all you're doing by responding in that way is showing them that there is no bottom to what you are willing to acquiesce to, right? Because as soon as you agree to the first thing, they're going to come back and say, okay, now there's a second thing that we need to do. Otherwise, your funding is going away. And then there's going to be a third thing, and then there's going to be a fourth thing. And pretty soon, your values really don't exist anymore because they've been able to whittle them away with the promise of funding. Your values only exist so far as you're willing to incur consequences for them. If you are not willing to incur consequences for them, they are not your values. That is just something that you like to say about yourself. That's a very different thing. If you're not willing to put something on the line, whether it be funding, resources, your personal reputation, whatever it is, authoritarians are coming for those things. Like, they know where the pressure points are. And so you need to draw a hard line in the sand and determine what your values are and stick to them. And if that means that you don't get funding the next year, that might be what it means. We're having those really tough conversations here at our organization too. And I anticipate some of our funding streams are going to dry up because of that. We recently just had IHHS, for instance, invite us to do a summer kind of talk, lunch and learn webinar type thing about the LGBTQ community and the risk of suicide around that. It was literally, the title of the presentation was literally LGBTQ 101, and they asked us to take all the LGBTQ aspects out of it, take away the information about sexual orientation, take away the information about gender identity, take away the information about how the legislation is impacting people differentially, and we said no. Pull our funding, do it. We double dare you because we're not going to lie on your behalf. And that's what I would tell organizations. Don't lie on the behalf of people who are just going to take your funding away for something the year after that. It's not going to stop.
Yeah,
I appreciate that. Can I speak up for
Sure.
classroom
Yep.
teachers?
Yep.
So, I feel like I got out before this, right? So I've been out of the classroom for 7 years. I did have parents that I heard from when I was teaching seventh graders global studies, and we were learning about the Middle East, and we learned about Judaism and Christianity and Islam. And I had the privilege to stand up, and I had the support of my principal. And so the folks now, the fear is real. The law doesn't really have any teeth yet. They're not coming for people's licenses. It's like, don't do this, but there's no real consequence written into the law. But the fear is out there, and we've experienced it with our cultural programs in the classroom, where somebody got scared and thought, oh, is this CRT, or is this divisive concept, or can we do this? So I think it's really about the education piece. You can still talk about divisive concepts. You just don't say it's that white people are bad, or that America is a whole is racist. It doesn't mean you can't. So navigate what is allowed under the law, because you can still talk about it under the law. You really can. So I think there, those of us who are able to reach out and provide some opportunity, some learning, not just for teachers, educators, but also for families and their children.
A lot of those decisions are going to be made at local school level,
Mhm.
as far as curriculum and things. And judging by driving around the Linn-Mar school district, it seems like there's a school board vote coming up. I'm seeing a lot of signs. And of course, here we were sort of the district that Republican candidates at various levels like to attack due to the gender support plan that the school district put in place. Keenan, you're out there, surveying the landscape. What are the school board elections looking like to you this fall?
Yeah, well, we're getting involved in them for the first time ever. We have never been involved in school board elections before, but this was there was an acknowledgement among our team that this was one of the only ways that we could stop the bleeding from the legislature this year. Was to put people in place who are going to interpret some of this really harmful stuff in the least harmful way possible, who are going to keep as many books on the shelves as they could, who are going to keep, as many kids alive, quite frankly, as possible. And so, yeah, we're explicitly making endorsements. We're explicitly organizing for some of these candidates, which is not a position that we would have ever been in had the legislature not done what it just did. So this is entirely reactive to their moves. This is not proactive on our part. Now, one of the interesting things is what I'm hearing from a lot of candidates on the ground is the number one question that they're getting on the doors, even from registered Republicans, is, are you one of those book banners? The book banning thing is actually very not popular, even among Republicans, even among folks who would identify themselves as kind of staunch social conservatives. Book banning, not great, because they know that there ultimately is going to be consequences for them as well, that there are going to be books that come off the shelves that they like, right? Everybody knows that if you put in a censorship regime, it's ultimately the censor that is kind of the question, and there is no sort of neutral censorship that doesn't exist. So what I'm seeing a lot in these school board races is, number one, that focus on censorship, and then number two, candidates running on a platform that the legislature has already really resolved for them, running on issues of parental rights and making sure that parents have, well, the legislature has already mandated that, right? Like the legislature has already mandated restrooms. I see people running on restrooms. The legislature has already mandated this, sex acts in books coming off the shelves, which very much reminds me of how they responded when the legislature had mandated all the masking stuff that they wanted and all the COVID stuff that they wanted. And then they were really left without a platform, and they started just kind of dismantling things and scaring people about other three-letter acronyms. So I imagine that's what's coming in the relatively near future, is they will shift away from the LGBTQ stuff, because again, already resolved. I mean, it's like a fun issue for them to campaign on, I guess, but that their policy platforms are nothing that they actually have to act on at all. So they're going to have a lot of time on their hands, should they win, which I suspect that they won't.
We've got another question from the audience that this strikes me as being a navigating the culture war by turning your car in one of the directions toward a border. They're saying, with the political climate seemingly unlikely to change in the near future, why should LGBTQ plus people stay in Iowa or pursue opportunities here? And either of you can, talk about, on a personal level. I'm sure that, there's your daughter, made a choice where she wanted to live, I'm sure. And so, yeah, either one of you want to talk about that.
I would defer to Keenan because I'm not queer.
You have a queer kid, though, so I do
do.
ultimately want to hear your thoughts, because that's going to be a big part of your life, right? Look, I'm of two thoughts on this. I don't begrudge a single person who leaves to improve their life, right? I don't begrudge a single person who changes their zip code because there are more rights for them in a different zip code. That said, do I think that it's a good idea for LGBTQ people to flee the state? No. Do I think that it's a good idea for them to flee any state? Not really. And the reason is, let's imagine that we got every queer person out of the state today, right? Like tomorrow, there would be another queer kid born. And so it would and then they would be all alone and with nobody else to create community and nobody else to speak up in the same way that a queer person can speak up on behalf of their own community. So I think there are reasonable positions in both directions. I would never ask a queer person to stay simply to do that, but I would say you have to take this into consideration, that ultimately there is power in having a queer community, even in an area where our very existence is kind of a political controversy.
I have to say that if my daughter were not grown, it would be a whole lot of thinking about what to do, because if she couldn't get gender affirming care, that would be paramount. We would need to go where she could get it. So I certainly understand it. It takes all of us to do what we need to do to take care of ourselves and build community influence the way that we can. So I'm very gratified that she's still here and that she can be out and be I mean, she's fantastic. She's a fantastic person. She's a wonderful human being. So the more folks that get to see that, the more hearts and minds I think will change, and that normalization process will happen. She is very, very male presenting, and even at sometimes male expressing. And so having so many different varieties helps us all know that, again, it's a construct. Gender is a construct, a social construct, and that however somebody wants to express is really up to them. And I love like going to Pride, and that it is a place for people, and people like me, somebody that's been heavy my whole adult life, that is completely comfortable in what I'm wearing and what my body looks like, and because it's so accepting, and it's not, again, that construct of beauty, what's beautiful. There's impact on that too, that we get to decide, even though we're informed by our culture, by our rearing, and by our experiences in society and all of that. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could decide together? And anyway, I'm rambling.
The one
No.
additional thing I'll say to this too is just that, while I'm not sold on every queer person leaving, I certainly understand why it's not attractive to queer people to move here, right? Like that is definitely a tough sell, and not one that I'm willing to make, to be completely frank at this point. And so, the business community, who has always had a top priority around workforce and getting people to come here and work, these kinds of policies are running exactly opposite to that goal of attracting new folks. Like, we are arbitrarily excluding this entire category of people, not just queer people, but people, cis, straight people with queer kids as well,
Yeah.
who are, very qualified. And I already know of, a top lawyer who left the state because they had a trans kid. I know of a medical specialist who left the state because they had a trans kid. I know several food service workers who left the state because they have trans kids. These are people who are essential to our communities, right? They make our communities run. Our rural communities can't lose many more medical specialists and still provide the services that they need to their residents. So this has impacts that are far greater than just the queer community. This is hurting us as a state.
Well, and it seems like, Iowa kind of has a split personality with regard to the, state government. And, you've got this legislature that's doing this kind of stuff and the governor's signing it. But then you've got these efforts like This Is Iowa, and these efforts to get people to come here. And they feature young, diverse, professional people. I mean, they had the deal, it was a few years ago, where they set up a fake real estate office in New York City, and to show these people how much house they could get for a lot less money in Iowa. And one of the couples that was there was a same-sex couple in that particular video. And yet the government is not helping the cause of recruiting young, professional, diverse people with these kind of policies, right?
Yeah, I mean, it feels a lot like putting a Band-Aid on like an amputated limb or something, right? Like these little piddly efforts really pale in comparison to the idea that your kid can't get the health care that their doctor has recommended, or that your kid can't use the appropriate restroom in school, or that your kid can't even hear or read books about people who are like them, or if folks get their way around religious exemptions next year, that you can't get the health care that you need simply because you're a queer person. That's going to be a bigger deal than that a gallon of milk is maybe a little cheaper here. I think a lot of folks are willing to pay a lot more to make sure that their kids are safe.
And it seems like part of the issue with people deciding whether to go or stay, there's also this aspect that was touched on in the question from the audience, that the politics here seems locked in. It doesn't seem like there's much of a chance that Democrats are going to have a resurgence and we're going to go back to being sort of a purple state with a divided legislature that curbs the worst political impulses that of our dueling wings. I mean, is that part of it? Is that or do you have more hope than that about the politics? And either of you can take that on.
I totally do. Not to put the burden on millennials and Gen Z, but they are a great voting bloc, and they are just more progressive in their thinking. They're socially progressive. They might be fiscally conservative. We don't have a party where that fits exactly, but yeah, I have a ton of hope. I don't know. Maybe I would leave too, right? I have a ton of hope. And our foreign-born population, right? I don't know who remembers this, but when I was a kid, we had 6 congressional districts in Iowa. We're down to 4. And if we didn't have our foreign-born population here, we'd only have 3. And so that combination of things, and as folks in the rural communities are looking to be more inclusive and to learn about their neighbors and to attract people so that they don't have these dying communities, all the school consolidation that happened, people can't even go to school near where they live. If we want to reframe, let's reframe it to the bottom line. Communities are going to die out. Businesses are going to die out. To Keenan's point, right? If you want to attract the best and the brightest, you're going to have to get on board with honoring the diversity of your employees. And that goes for people that aren't even necessarily marginalized. We all have intersecting identities and different styles, and being somebody who has a large capacity to accept and adapt to difference helps you navigate those differences. That person who's acting like that and it bugs you, well, when you get to know them, you're like, oh, I know why they're like that, or I like all these other things about them, so I'll put up with that. It really is deepening your complexity of understanding of people, because culture is communication, communication is culture, and getting to that deeper level allows us to invite, to welcome, to include. And I have tremendous hope for this state. And I think a purple state is an inclusive state, right? Again, honoring the different perspectives and valuing the lived experiences. So I don't mind being a blue state, but I think a purple state is really more inclusive.
And I think, organizing is ultimately a hopeful endeavor. I don't think I could do this work if I wasn't ultimately hopeful that we could, make things better for people. I guess I always just think of Kansas during the Brownback era, and how there was eventually a point where it was too far, right? And I don't know what that point is in Iowa, but these folks are really pushing limits at this point, and they really think that they can do just anything that they want without consequences, which is exactly where Brownback's Kansas was. And at some point, they're going to take it too far, and it's going to ultimately, the tide is going to turn. Now, does it turn enough that we have a blue state? Probably not, at least not in the next couple decades. But does it turn to a point where folks ultimately are starting to moderate themselves? I think that's a much more reasonable expectation, and it is one that I hold, that we will hit a point, and my belief is that was this year, but that we will hit a point at some point in the near future where this goes too far, and where people recognize that their government has ultimately been taken over by a group of extremists who are more interested in their ideological goals than they are with the practical realities of their constituents.
Alongside the, the optimism for maybe change in the future, where do you think these issues are headed when the legislature comes back with a campaign next year? I mean, what are you concerned about? Either you, Keenan, you're at the State House a lot.
Yeah. I think the big two words next year are religious exemptions, as I've said many times before. And I think the big ticket item that they would really like to get across the finish line is what's called a RFRA, or a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a bit of legislation that would essentially allow people to pick and choose which laws they're going to follow based on whatever religious beliefs they're professing at the time. As I said, I expect the business community to come out fairly aggressively against that, because I think there are obvious problems for them in that kind of a regime. But if they can't get that, I expect that they will try to do what one of their other bills was this year, which was religious exemptions specifically for healthcare providers and facilities, which I think can be extremely damaging as well. And I think for relatively obvious reasons, right? If people can pick and choose their patients based on protected characteristics, that's a bad situation for pretty much everybody, except for the providers who just get to do whatever they want. Aside from that, I do expect that they will try to push boundaries on some of their victories that they've already gotten, right? They'll take the K-6, don't say gay, don't say trans, and try to expand it as far as they can, whether that's K-8 or K-12. They will continue their assault on DEI efforts. One of the things that was maybe less noticed this year was there was kind of initially a bill to completely ban all DEI programs and spending on our college campuses completely. And then that was pared back to a freeze with a study about DEI efforts on campuses. But we know that that study is ultimately, it's not a fact-finding mission, right? The conclusion has already been determined. It is to get ammunition for their predetermined conclusion so that they can then next year say, this is what we learned and this is why we want to ban it completely. And so those are the kinds of things that we will be watching for, are just like continued gradations of some of the wins that they've already had, plus a focus on some of that religious exemption stuff.
Do you think there's any chance that they try to remove gender identity from the Civil Rights Code? I mean, that seems to be getting in their way with regard to some of these school, public accommodation rules and things like that. We haven't seen the court challenges yet, but they're probably coming at some point.
Yeah, I agree. I think that might be a little bit more than they can chew. I'm sure that they will attempt again, but I know that there is at least a decent portion of that caucus, even among the folks that typically don't support us, that believe that removing an entire class from the Civil Rights Act is a bridge too far. And that, I believe, is another area where the business community would say, hey, whoa. Like, we need to keep these basic protections around housing and things like this for our transgender employees. And so this is, again, that one-to-one relationship where they're not going to be able to avoid going up against some of the less typical folks. They don't just have to deal with me, and they don't have to just deal with Iowa Safe Schools and ACLU and Interfaith Alliance and kind of the normal players. They're going to deal with all sorts of other folks who are typically more on their side of the aisle, and that's often a very difficult position for them to be in. So I think obviously they're going to try it. I mean, they've tried it for the past 4 years in a row or so. There's no chance that bill isn't filed and at least looked at. But do I think that is a successful effort? I would put that kind of at the bottom of my list of worries compared to some of the other things that I just listed. Is it possible? Sure, but I think it's one of the less plausible things.
So we're getting down to the wire here. I was going to ask you, if you encounter an Iowan that doesn't like the way things are going on in this culture war, what's your main recommendation to how they can have some impact?
Build relationship.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think this divisive climate, the opposite of this is community, right? And so And that isn't just like, building relationships with legislators either. I think you should do that, obviously. And I think you should volunteer with organizations that are working on things you care about, and volunteer with your local mutual aid organizations and things like that. But I also think that you should care about what your neighbor needs, right? Like if they are struggling and they need something, that's maybe somewhere to look as well, and start building the relationships that are really in close proximity to you. And then you'll eventually start having conversations. There's like no way as humans that we don't have conversations about things that matter to us. So starting with, your neighbors, starting with your neighborhood organization or your community organizations or your church, your workplace, all the things that you're kind of already involved in just by proximity, but being a little bit more intentional with those, I think that's a great place for folks to start, especially if like going up to the legislature or having coffee with a legislator seems terrifying. Don't start there. Start smaller, build those relationships, and get to that point where you can have those conversations.
I could add one more
Go
thing
ahead.
if we have a minute. Thinking about depolarizing within, right? We get into those echo chambers again and we vent, and particularly when lives are on the line, it's very important to fight. However, when we are so polarized, we can overgeneralize and we can miss those opportunities to connect with people who have different ideas than we do. It takes all of us. We need to be in the fight, right? Again, there are hills upon which to die. But I try to operate with, I think I'm right. I've done my research. I've learned this, but I could be wrong. I could be wrong. I could be missing something. So sort of having that, reframing your own view of the world, and that, gosh, there may be something here that I could learn from and learn about, and I'm open to it.
Yeah, having that curiosity. Yeah.
Lead with curiosity. Ascribe good intentions to others.
Great advice. And this has been a great conversation. I thank you both for agreeing to join the panel. And I'm going to thank our sponsors real quick: Cedar Rapids Bank and Trust, Inclusive CR, and ITC Midwest helped bring you this conversation. So appreciate that help. And we didn't solve the culture war. I don't think we lost it, but either. So good news, I guess. That's the hope.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you to both.